Hey everyone. For those of you who just joined, my name is Akshita Vaidula. I'm a postdoc at the University of Richmond. I do astrophysics and early universe observational cosmology. And I'm also one of the program managers with SEEDS. SEEDS is Stories of Ethics, Engagement, and Dialogue in Science. It's an initiative designed to foster dialogue about ethical issues in science and approaches scientists can take to understand them. Seats is hosted by ComSciCon, and I actually see a lot of familiar faces from ComSciCon here. But for those of you who are not familiar with it, ComSciCon is a nonprofit, and it is best known for its workshop series organized by the graduate students for the graduate students. And it also focuses on science communication, science policy, science diplomacy sort of workshops. Seeds is generously and proudly funded by our sponsors, the Calvi Foundation and the Rita Allen Foundation. One of the major goals of SEEDS projects is to elevate the stories of scientists who engage with the ethical dimensions and implications of their research. Written by early career researchers, these stories will share valuable insights into how scientists can start to do the boundary spanning, community oriented work needed to bring societal consideration into the research process. Through a publication arriving later this year, curated conference programming, and public webinars, aims to equip researchers and communicators with the tools to navigate complex ethical dilemmas, promote inclusive dialogues, and strengthen the connection between science and the society. Today's webinar is the first of three in our public webinar series, and it addresses another major goals of SEEDS, which is to create dialogues with the subject matter experts in science, ethics, and public engagements about the ethical and societal dimensions of basic science research and the effective approaches for grappling with them. So today to guide us through the workshop on working on X in the space of Y, expertise and adaptability in transdisciplinary work, we have with us Dr. Samantha Jo Fried, Associate Director of Civic Studies at the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University, and she's also a research professor at the Tisch College. And in these roles, she develops curricula and educational resources. She teaches and advises students, and she oversees budgets, plans and runs programmatic events and faculty governance. And she also does community partnership work, research, and grant writing. Most recently, she taught a course called Civic Knowledge, How We Know Things. The course sits at the intersection of science, technology, and society, or STS, and civic studies, and it explores the relationship between theory and practice, and it is centered around community partnership. So we are so glad to have Dr. Fried with us today to share her expertise. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Fried to get us started with our first webinar.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. So let me just share my screen. Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Sam. I am going to be talking today about working on X in the space of Y, expertise and adaptability in transdisciplinary work. So I want to start off by proposing a series of premises. The first is that expertise should matter. The second premise, probably not too controversial within this particular group, is that different forms of expertise in the scholarly and research world are often not legible to each other in the way that they ought to be for a truly good collaboration. So in this webinar, we will dig into the mechanics of this illegibility, why does it happen, and what can we do about it? The third premise is that not all expertise comes from formal university training. So we'll explore these premises today through some sociological theory, the periodic table of expertise, and we'll combine this framework with some anecdotal evidence to really get at the complexity of these issues. So my background is in an interdisciplinary field called science, technology, and society, sometimes called science and technology studies, STS for short. It's the history, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, and sometimes policy of science and engineering. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about the particular expertise that scientists and engineers hold and how it is different from my own. Um, by way of a civic science postdoctoral fellowship about 7 years ago, I moved from the STS world into the world of civic studies slash the civic engagement space. And in this space, I've been thinking less about scientific knowledge specifically and a little more about how knowledge writ large and different forms of knowledge and expertise are important to social movements and really to anybody who wants to make institutional change. So I've been doing more work with partners outside the university. And I didn't have any formal community partnership experience when I came to the College of Civic Life. But I did have the experience of having X kind of expertise in an environment where most people hold expertise in Y. And I found that's a valuable experience to draw upon when it comes to building relationships inside and outside of the university. So I am a theorist primarily and a humanist. And for that reason, I like to ground everything I do in humanistic theoretical frameworks. Yay. Some of you might have a reaction to this, like, but what about practice? And I'll say two things about that. One, yes, absolutely. What about practice? I care about it too. And two, the philosopher of science, Hilary Putnam, believed that all theory was based in practice and vice versa. In 2003, he wrote, ideas are not just ideas, they are guides to action. Our notions of knowledge, probability, certainty, etc., are all linked to and frequently used in contexts in which action is at issue. May I confidently rely upon a certain idea? Shall I rely upon it tentatively, with a certain caution? Is it necessary to check on it? In other words, frameworks ultimately do describe experience, and they are meant to be tested continually in reference to experience. So this is all to say that theoretical frameworks like the ones I use in my work and life are grounded in action, and they ground action simultaneously. And for that reason, I'll spend the first part of this webinar talking about a theoretical framework about expertise called the periodic table of expertise. Um, to set your expectations, and to be honest, it has no structural or functional resemblance to the periodic table of elements. There aren't like 100 plus kinds of distinct expertise broken down by some key function that's analogized to atomic number, although I think that would be super cool. But I do think it's a helpful way of thinking about expertise in interdisciplinary and maybe transdisciplinary collaborations and in life. And I'm also curious about your reactions to this framework. So there will be about 5 to 7 minutes for you to react to the periodic table of expertise through a live poll or by responding in the chat. Then I'll tell you a personal anecdote about my own experience holding X kind of expertise in a Y kind of space. I'm hoping to entertain you a little, to be real about the unspoken hierarchies of institutionalized expertise, and to helpfully situate my experiences with expertise in the periodic table of expertise framework. Then, in the remainder of this session, I'll ask you to begin to develop your own personal anecdotes about expertise grounded in the periodic table framework. So you might have a feeling like this periodic table framework is really being pushed on me, and I don't like that. And if that's you, I hear you. I am sometimes that person. And for that reason, when I teach, I often like to offer multiple frameworks because sometimes theories just really don't fit the practice or the experience that someone is bringing to the table. I don't have time to offer you multiple theoretical frameworks today because that's not the point. But you are welcome to frame your anecdotes as challenges to or as proposed amendments to the periodic table of expertise if you don't see yourself in that framework. So you'll chat in small groups about that framework, and then we'll move back into this larger group for the end of the session. And if there is time over, I'm happy to respond to any questions or comments that you might have. So without further ado, let's jump into it. The periodic table of expertise is an invention of British sociologists of science, Harry Collins and Robert Evans, in their 2007 book, Rethinking Expertise. Importantly, Collins and Evans' conceptualization of expertise is very much based in this other concept, this idea of tacit knowledge. Has anybody heard this term before? Show of hands? I don't know. Thumbs up, reaction, something. Okay, well, Collins published a rather well-known in STS article about this back in 1974. And in this article, he aims to show how hard it is to train people in scientific methodologies. At 7 different British laboratories and 5 North American laboratories, he studies the scientific culture and literature around something called the T laser, or the transversely excited atmospheric laser. This is basically a laser that sends an electrical current through gas to produce light. So the T laser is really not easy for labs to build. And while there's a lot of training literature to help labs build their own T lasers, Collins found that no one he'd interviewed had successfully reconstructed the T laser using any of the training literature alone. Perhaps, obviously, the T laser is not IKEA furniture. You can't just build it with a diagram and a good drink in hand. Rather, scientists learned how to build T-set lasers because they had continued contact with someone or a community of people who walked them through the process. So I took us on this little detour to 1974 because tacit knowledge is an undergirding theme of the periodic table of expertise. Basically, tacit knowledge is foundational to expertise, and expertise is acquired not just by reading or watching technical material, but through continued interpersonal interaction with an established community of experts. Because expertise isn't acquired just one way, through just one means, it's hard to unpack quickly, and that's what makes it expertise. So I'll briefly walk us through this table. As you can see, there are 4 main categories: ubiquitous expertise, specialist expertise, meta expertise, and meta criteria. And then there are also these dispositions, which are very important, but also kind of their own thing. So don't worry. I'll explain those later. Just hold that in your mind and know that I'm going to address it. Um, so ubiquitous expertise is at the top of the table. And I find that a little confusing because oddly, it's foundational. Natural language speaking is a form of ubiquitous expertise, as is, according to Collins and Evans, quote, all those expertises one needs to make political judgments, unquote. That's on page 13 of the book. There's a lot to unpack there, all those expertises one needs to make political judgments. But just because a form of expertise is common doesn't mean it's easy to acquire. Um, when someone has ubiquitous expertise, they have a huge body of tacit knowledge, right, Collins and Evans. They've been in a community for a while learning things. And I also really like this definition of tacit knowledge that they have here. Things you just know how to do without being able to explain the rules for how you do them. It's also on page 13. So, in summary, ubiquitous expertise is common, but it's also crucial. Everyone has some because you need it to live in a society, and it's really hard to explain to other people how you have it, which can give the impression that it's just a cinch to learn, but it's actually really hard to learn. Okay, so let's move on to the second highest rung on this table. Specialist expertise, which is a continuous scale here. The left-hand most side of the scale, beer mat or coaster knowledge, is like trivia knowledge. These are recallable fun facts on something you encounter in your daily life, maybe. Facts on a Snapple cap, if you remember those facts, the ones that are true at least, could also fit into this category. Uh, is anyone familiar with this other image, which has stumped many children and perhaps served as an early lesson about trick questions as a force of chaotic evil? Anyone? Thumbs up? Okay. Well, in the Pokemon universe, at least, this is beer mat knowledge about what the Pokemon Jigglypuff looks like from above. And Collins and Evans stress that these kinds of fun facts are easy to learn and to recall. And as an aside, you've probably figured it out by now, but I love Jigglypuff. So as you move toward the right in this specialist expertise portion of this chart, the knowledge becomes increasingly more intricate. I would liken popular understanding to the knowledge you might acquire watching Bill Nye the Science Guy, if any of you watched that. When I was little, I watched a ton of Bill Nye the Science Guy, and I was especially taken with this episode about the primordial soup, and I would not stop talking about how we were all in the primordial soup. And while some people probably found that cute, and some people probably found it annoying, absolutely nobody would have said, this 6-year-old is an expert biochemist. I didn't know, actually, until I looked it up for this presentation, that this theory underwent like a whole series of evolutions and modifications. I just knew it very broadly as a 6-year-old and definitely reductively as a concept. And that's really the essence of popular understanding, the basics of an idea or concept. So, oh, still on this slide, with primary source knowledge, this center category here, um, the specialist expertise grows more skill-based. So primary source knowledge is held by someone with basic research skills who can navigate primary sources, maybe at the level of writing a good basic research paper. I would say that one aim at least, of high school education and undergraduate education is to train students to have primary source knowledge. By the end of my college experience, I knew how to write a really focused paper on obscure German film, and I was so proud of that skill. And really, if someone had called me up and said, you know so much about German indie cinema between the years 1970 and 2005, can you offer your expert opinion on it? I would have babbled at them like for hours, but much to the chagrin of 22-year-old me, that never would have happened because being able to write a solid paper does not make someone truly an expert in the view of this table. So what does? We're getting into more of what Collins and Evans think creates true expertise with interactional expertise. It is even more skill-based, and I would say it is also really importantly relationship-based. Someone with this kind of expertise, for instance, could have a technical conversation with a biochemist about what they do. They might not hold a PhD in biochemistry, but they probably, oh, hold on. There we go. They might not have a PhD in biochemistry, but they probably hang out with biochemists regularly, enough that they know how to read, understand, and be conversant in some of this research. Collins and Evans give examples of a handful of professional roles that require interactional expertise, including accomplished journalists, sociologists, anthropologists, and peer reviewers. That's on page 14 of the book. So, interactive expertise, someone you learn, someone you, someone, oh my goodness, I did a bad job of writing this part of the script. Interactive expertise. You learn this from spending a lot of time with experts in a given field, even when you don't actually belong to that field. So the last kind of expertise on the rightmost side, the most expertise here is contributory expertise. This is the kind you would need to be a competent scientist or researcher. So if you have contributory expertise in biochemistry, you don't only talk to other biochemists about what they do, you do that, but you are also doing the research and publishing it in journals of biochemistry. So you are actually contributing to the field. Many, if not all of you in this Zoom room, hold contributory expertise in your respective fields. So those were the 5 types of specialist expertise on a sliding scale. We'll move on now to meta expertise, which is expertise about expertise. External expertise is decided by judges who don't possess the expertise themselves, but who judge whether someone else does based on, as Collins and Evans put it, the expert's demeanor, the internal consistency of their remarks, the appropriateness of their social locations, and so forth. They call this transmuted expertise because somebody is actually using social cues really to make judgments about technical knowledge. So those of you who aren't in STS are using this form of expertise right now. You might be judging whether I am worth listening to based on the way I'm speaking, how much the concepts I'm explaining to you make sense in reference to each other, maybe even what my Zoom background looks like. I bet there are Zoom backgrounds that would make you go, yeah, I'm not listening to her. If I put one of those like emoji cat avatars over my face at the start of this webinar, that would make me instantly unreputable to you. So you would be using external expertise. I won't review the various kinds for the sake of time. I know it's kind of distracting, like ubiquitous discrimination, local discrimination, etc. They're not really important to your understanding of the table, but I am prepared to talk about them later, like in the Q&A if you're curious. So while external experts do not hold the kind of expertise the person they are judging has, internal experts do. Internal expertise is held by people who have at least some of the kind of expertise the person they are judging has. Collins and Evans give this example of the art critic. So the art critic isn't a practicing artist, probably, but they probably trained as a studio artist, maybe even as an art historian. So here again is this focus from Collins and Evans on practice and communities of practice. The art critic isn't part of that artist's community of practice per se, but the art critic knows something about art. So maybe some of you have fine arts backgrounds. If so, we share this because I actually do. I don't know about you, but when I go to art museums, there are some pieces that make me go, ugh, I know what went into this and it does not impress me. And then there are some pieces that make me go, wow, that must have taken hours upon hours of time, concentration, thoughtfulness, etc. I'm so impressed by that piece. So this is a further example of this kind of internal expertise at work. And finally, we have meta criteria. These are easy to explain. Don't worry, I'm almost done like throwing a barrage of information at you. This is criteria that you might use to judge whether someone has expertise or not when you do not have that expertise yourself. Checking an expert's qualifications is a good stand-in for knowing something about their level of expertise. So meta criteria are qualifications like credentials, experience, track record. Here's an example. I have credentials, a PhD in STS. So you're trusting that what I'm talking about here today is really STS and that I'm not just making it up as I go along. That way, you don't actually have to do graduate study in STS to listen to this webinar because that would be like a whole extra thing for you and a pretty re unreasonable ask for me as a speaker to you as an audience, and also maybe inadvisable. So that was a lot to digest. I want to pause briefly to see, does anybody have a conceptual question? Like a question that your understanding of these concepts really depends on? I can devote a minute. Maybe like raise a hand so I see you.
Oh no, feel free to also drop questions in the chat at any point if you'd like to, and we can relay them.
Yes, Christopher.
So, as I'm understanding it now, as we're trying to define expertise, we're sort of building in groups and out groups because we're saying that people are have this interactional expertise. They can speak with the people of this particular type. So uh, that now we're putting in by definition in groups and out groups by definition. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. Maybe you'll find this silly, but I would use slightly different language than that. I think it's about communities. Like expertise to Collins and Evans is so much based on relationships and relationship building that it has to be about communities. So yeah, in groups and out groups is a part of that, but I don't
But
think it's all of that.
yeah, because I would say a chess engine, I'm going to rely on it it has expertise that I want, but that doesn't mean the chess engine is an in-group or out-group kind of a thing. I can easily anybody can figure out whether the chess engine works or not because they can put a bunch of chess engines, play them against each other, and so forth. So this expertise is truly valuable to me as a chess player if I want to win, but it doesn't really have all of the social oddities that we're so frustrated with in academia.
Hmm. That's an interesting point. And I thought about this a little in my dissertation research, so maybe I'll talk about it more in the Q&A, but I don't really know how to play chess. So therefore, I don't know that I would be able to like deal with the chess engine, and I would probably need somebody to teach me. And I could read about that, but it would be way more helpful if somebody like actually showed me how chess worked and then also how the chess engine worked. And maybe it wouldn't take as long as like somebody really trying to understand the primordial soup, but there's still this process of like learning tacit knowledge through relationships, if that makes sense.
Nobody learns how to play chess today. If you want to win at chess, you just follow the machine. It's that simple. So everybody can play at grandmaster chess level. They just say to the machine, "What's the next move?" and that's going to be the best thing. We
Hmm.
to determine how good of a human being is at chess, we compare them to machines. If you're as close as you are to the machine, as close as you can figure out what the machine is going to say, that's how good you are. So yeah, you don't need expertise. You just need to be able to figure out how to access the expertise that's out there.
I
Hmm.
don't think I agree with you, but
Okay.
I think this is actually a really interesting philosophical point you're making. Maybe let's talk about it later because I
Yeah.
want to move on to the next slide.
Yeah.
Um,
Thank you for raising that. I just want to flag one more question that appeared in the chat.
oh yeah, of
Just
course.
asking you to clarify under meta criteria the difference between experience and track record.
The difference between experience and track record. Yeah, um, that's a good question. I feel like I can't give you the best answer right now because I would have to go back to the text and like really understand how Collins and Evans are breaking that apart. So if you give me your email, I will email you after this, okay? Because that's a great question. Thank you. Okay, so before we move on, let's do a short poll. So, two different questions. The first question is, which kind of expertise sticks out to you the most and why? And the second question is, which kinds of expertise are you most comfortable holding and why? So once you answer, just let's take a couple minutes. I'm really curious to hear like what you think about this and why. So you can pop an answer in the chat, or you can raise your hand. Super interesting. I don't know if I expected you to answer in any particular way, but I'm interested by your answers. I have to say that I agree. I'm more comfortable holding specialist expertise than any other kinds of expertise. Maybe that's why I do what I do. So story time. This is me on March 21st, 2019, just minutes before I entered my dissertation defense. So my dad insisted on taking this photo, and I was feeling kind of grumpy about it at the time, as you can probably tell with the expression on my face. But in hindsight, I'm glad he like captured this moment in time for me because it's helpful to see on my face how serious this was for me and how much I felt was at stake in this defense. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what exactly was at stake for me. I did my graduate degree at Virginia Tech. You might be able to tell from the picture, I'm not sure. There are only a few official STS departments in the country, and Virginia Tech has one of them. And while I was there, I held a graduate assistantship, or really, I was paid through this interdisciplinary program called an Interdisciplinary Graduate Education Program, or an IGEP for short. So there were 14, at least at the time, I don't know how many there are now, of these interdisciplinary collaborations across the university. And they were initially intended as like Venus flytraps for these NSF IGERT grants, which no longer exist. They were these grants sort of encouraging people to do interdisciplinary work across the university. And so all of the 14 IGEPs at Virginia Tech focused around a STEM-based issue. So the program I belonged to was the one here, the remote sensing IGEP. So remote sensing is a satellite-based sensing of the Earth's surface and sometimes of space. Most people in this group were from fields like forestry and electrical engineering and geography, and everyone else was doing something specifically related to remote sensing, whereas that was not at all my area of expertise when I arrived. I was the weird humanist. So within this group, I had a lot of trouble making myself understood and explaining what exactly I did in terms that felt right to me and in terms people in the IGEP would understand too. And to be clear, I don't blame anyone for this. I think this is a systemic issue, and my experience is just one instance of interdisciplinary collaboration presenting these huge difficulties of translation. So, as part of the program, I had to give a poster presentation every year in the spring and multiple talks to this remote sensing group over the course of 4 years. And this was really tricky for me for a number of reasons. So, first of all, in my department, there were no poster presentations. It's just not a norm in STS. And I'm not saying that no one in the STS world does posters. And also, this was like 7 to 11 years ago. So I don't know, maybe posters are more common now in the STS world, but back then they were not. And since it wasn't really a norm to do posters, I didn't really have guidance from mentors or peers about how one turns really early stage graduate student thoughts in the humanities into a poster. Another difficulty of translation was that my research wasn't about sensor design or data analysis of like digital Earth imagery. It was about how remote sensing is a social institution like all sciences, and really like all institutionalized ways of knowing at universities and other research centers. It it was always in the forefront of my mind, by the way, and still is, that the social sciences and humanities too are ordered socially and institutionally. Nonetheless, it is weird to tell your colleagues and professors every year who don't usually think in these terms that you know what they're doing is a social process and here's how. Sometimes people were kind of resistant to hearing this, and sometimes that frustrated me, but looking back on it, I can't blame them. I might feel really weird too if someone who did not hold my form of expertise came in and was like, I'm imagining your work as a system and I'm studying it, making observations about it. So, pictured here are some examples of what I consider to be my failures. The first is a poster about how microscopy and Earth remote sensing are philosophically similar. This really did not resonate with many people at the poster session, which probably comes as no surprise to you, and neither did a poster about Sumerian map making. And it's not that I look back and think to myself, these were terrible ideas. They were well-intentioned, and I was really trying my best, but they just didn't land with people in this remote sensing research group, and I really needed them to land. So after these failures, I started noticing the kind of work my remote sensing colleagues valued. I was trying to get a little bit less in my feelings about not being valued or understood, and was thinking more like, what's the work that they do? Not just in technical terms, but in general descriptive terms, if I had to name them. So it was very clearly skill and practice-based work, even where it was very theoretical. It was about learning how to use a new tool, a new kind of sensing technique, a new data analysis or data harmonization technique. There was always a clear outcome to these projects, and my colleagues were highly rhetorically effective at connecting that clear and specific outcome to a broader goal, like to understand trees and know how to take better care of them, to understand the environment and to protect it, etc. The humanities, I think, don't quite operate in this way. Um, there, there was not really a clear outcome to what I was doing at the outset, and it was difficult to impossible to describe my skills in the language of the Earth remote sensing paradigm. I found also that there was really no responsible shorthand to describe my work. Like making Earth remote sensing more just or ethical just felt to me too ambitious and conceited. Maybe just the kind of thing my colleagues feared that I thought I was doing. And it would be really hard for me to claim intellectual humility with a statement like that. So this is one of a few reasons I ultimately chose to operate more like the group's resident historian, uncovering the history of satellite instrumentation. Something about the data collecting nature of archival research felt very analogous to my colleagues' research. Like we were all just collecting data and making sense of it. And I was valuing um, in this historical research, as they did, the technical aspects of satellite instrumentation. So knowing all of that stuff was actually really important to writing the history I wrote. Um, so these are two pictures from the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan and from the public-facing short version of my dissertation in the January-February 2020 issue of the American Scientist. I'm not going to talk much about the content of my dissertation now, but if you'd like to know more, I'd be happy to tell you in the Q&A at the end of the webinar. Another thing I did was this creative project that I called Knit the World. And yes, that is definitely a too ambitious name. I used this online software called Chartminder. I don't know if it still exists. I should have looked. To turn digital earth imagery into Fair Isle knitting patterns. And I pasted one particular pattern, this one in the middle here, into Adobe Illustrator and sort of used the dropper tool to identify the hex codes for colors that I saw as most prominent in the image and manually painted in additional stitches to make the knit pattern look closer to the original. Maybe this comparison won't make sense to you, or maybe you think I'm not making it correctly. And if that's the case, I am sorry. But I think it's a little bit like a manual kind of principal component analysis. So I ended up doing my final poster about this Knit the World project, and I got the sense that it resonated with my colleagues a bit more than anything I'd done because I was trying to figure out how to recreate a digital image in a way that adhered most to like the truth of something, and that's what they were doing. And I feel like I should tell you that these patterns are knittable, though it would be a whole tedious thing, and I'd be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. Anyway, this is the kind of flexibility and interdisciplinary humanist-leaning orientation gives me the ability to adapt my approach and my frameworks to the moment, as I was able to do here, was valuable. So if you work with humanists, I think you should know that this creative flexibility is a skill they might bring to a collaboration. So here's how I would describe this in Collins and Evans terms. My interactional expertise with respect to remote sensing grew over time. Like I wasn't publishing in remote sensing journals, but I could read the articles, basically understand them, talk to my colleagues about what they were doing. As I spent more time with that community of researchers and as I learned their theories and practices through coursework and seminars, I was better not able to understand not only the technical aspects of the field, but also the kinds of things my colleagues really cared about on a fundamental level, like what drove them to do the kinds of research they did and what kind of impact they wanted to make. I think all of us who are researchers are motivated by particular things because research is obsessive, like values, goals, experiences. And I think it's good to get to the heart of these things in a collaboration because they can connect people who don't at all hold the same expertise in unexpected ways. Collins and Evans use words like capacity and ability to describe the skill sets within interactional expertise. I might also use words like orientation or alignment. This is all to say these are very different kinds of skill sets than analyses of pixels in a digital image of Earth, than deep learning, than sensor design. If someone who is only thinking if someone is only thinking about valuable skill sets from the perspective of a scientist or an engineer with contributory expertise, it might be pretty difficult for them to understand how and why interactional expertise is useful, what a humanist can really contribute in an interdisciplinary collaboration. So I promised you some strategies for being an expert on X in an environment where everyone's expertise is on Y. And to be clear, my strategies and insights are coming from my perspective as a humanist. So you might not feel they relate to you directly, but even if they don't, I hope they might at least offer you a different way of thinking about things. So here's takeaway one. Interactive ability and reflective ability are important skills that humanists and social scientists bring to collaborations, and anyone can develop those skills. So I promised you we'd return to these little dispositions, and I am a woman of my word. According to Collins and Evans, dispositions are those skills or orientations or abilities that allow someone to develop interactional expertise. Collins and Evans call them interactive ability and reflective ability. So I would describe interactive ability as like curiosity plus a mind for systems thinking plus social and relationship building skills plus the ability to translate between different ways of knowing. It is understanding a niche field and also knowing how to code switch between that field and the world outside of it. To explain this, Collins and Evans use the example of a painter who believes that their work must speak for itself, and that if the meaning of a painting could be expressed in words, there would be no point in painting. That's on page 38 of their book. They describe a dynamic where it's really up to a bunch of art critics, actually, to dissect the paintings that this artist makes and make them understandable to their audiences. Those art critics have interactive ability. Reflective ability is the ability to ask deep questions about why a field or kind of expertise is the way it is. Collins and Evans observe that reflective ability is, quote, taught quite self-consciously in sociology and philosophy courses and the other critical disciplines, unquote. That's on page 39. I can confirm that this is true. They also observe that some scientists don't necessarily want to cultivate this ability because of the notion that, as Richard Feynman probably once said, quote, philosophy of science is about as useful to scientists as ornithology is to birds. This probably Feynman quotation also reminds me of this great poorly drawn lines comic. As you can see, the interviewer in the comic is asking this little seahorse about living in the ocean, but the seahorse has no idea that they're living in what the interviewer calls the ocean. Comedy ensues. It's absurd to expect this little seahorse to be the expert on something on this interviewer's terms in a way that does not impact its existence. Collins and Evans really empathize with this perspective, and I do too. And they offer a counterpoint also that I think is worth considering. So we should take seriously the idea that birds do hold valuable knowledge about the practice of flight, and that cute little seahorses do hold valuable knowledge about what it's like to live in the ocean, even if they don't really use that conceptual framework. And that scientists also hold a lot of valuable knowledge about the actual practice of science. It seems actually to me a little unfair to birds, or little seahorses, and scientists, the assumption that what they know about their process isn't valuable. Also, Collins and Evans argue that reflective ability is not limited to a particular kind of field or discipline. Anybody can develop it, and once someone has it, they can apply it anywhere. And I think it is possible to hold these two truths, like the absurdity of reflective ability, because it is kind of absurd, and the importance of recognizing that certain parties have it, just maybe on different terms than they'd initially imagined. Takeaway 2. This might seem obvious, but I think its obviousness is worth digging into. Contributory expertise is not the same as interactional expertise. And Collins and Evans actually write explicitly about how someone with contributory expertise doesn't hold necessarily interactive expertise. They call this latent interactional expertise. That's on page 37 of the book. In other words, anyone with contributory expertise can potentially translate their research and code switch across domains, but not unless they have intentionally developed interactive and reflective skill sets. I suppose there's another sneaky takeaway here, a normative one, or something I am arguing everybody should do a little more of. Develop interactional expertise and the skill sets that go along with them. But of course, I think more people should do that Because that's what I do. I am sort of being that annoying person who goes to presentations and says, "Why isn't this more like what I do?" We all know that person. I guess I am them sometimes, but okay, I think it's also really valuable. I really believe that interactional expertise and the skill sets that come with it are necessary to have a little bit of, at least in interdisciplinary collaborations. So, takeaway three, humanism contains ubiquitous knowledge, but it's not only made up of ubiquitous knowledge. I have a hypothesis. I think humanists and non-quantitative social scientists sometimes struggle to make themselves legible because the other kinds of skills they hold, close reading, writing, sometimes speaking, but not always, interpretation, critical thinking, on some level fall under what Collins and Evans classify as ubiquitous expertise, that which is the foundation of all other knowledge in society. And if you recall, they argued that while it's easy to assume ubiquitous equals low effort, foundational ubiquitous knowledge can be the hardest to learn and to explain after you've learned it. I think the commonness of reading, writing, interpretive skills sometimes makes it easy to assume that the work we do in the humanities holds less value, that anybody could do it right this second if they really wanted to. And yes, the work I do draws heavily from the kind of verbal and interpretive knowledge that is ubiquitous. But there is also this interactional component, and it's also contributory, like humanists have very specialized areas of study too, and journals that they publish in. So this brings me to my fourth takeaway, that understanding different forms of expertise is a process. This is all tricky because we can't help but apply our own expert lenses to other forms of expertise. In fact, STS as a field does that professionally and almost exclusively. And for that reason, I think we've developed good ways of doing it, but they're not perfect. So one way to do that is to reflect on the different ways of knowing around you, to think about how a skill in one area might not translate to another and vice versa. There is no endpoint at which someone knows they have arrived at like true understanding. Most of you hold forms of expertise that I don't know anything about. You might have your own takes on this framework and its usefulness, and your own uses for this framework that are different from mine. I'm not seeing this webinar as like, I'm dropping a bunch of knowledge on you that you need to know, and you'll definitely take it up in the way that I think you will. Rather, I'm sharing a framework that maps on to my experiences and that I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts on. This is a continuous dialogue, a constant process, and that's why I'm going to turn it over to you in just a moment. But before I do that, I want to address something else I promised you I would address in the description. Transdisciplinarity. That's working not only with people from different areas inside the university, but working with people outside of the university system too. I want to conclude by saying that those reflective and interactive skills Collins and Evans discuss, that I use in my scholarship and professional life, have been valuable to me in transdisciplinary collaborations with organized labor, for instance, or with community organizations. But leaving it there doesn't feel totally right to me. Like, it's true, but there's more. I believe that people I've collaborated with at small community nonprofits and in the trades, despite not being part of formal knowledge creating institutions like universities, hold knowledge that ought to be considered specialist expertise, something in the vein of contributory expertise. This is where I think Collins and Evans' framework falters because the highest form of expertise to them involves contributing to a field, as in publishing in journals. On one hand, if we are to understand different forms of expertise on different terms, it's reasonable that parts of this table might be more applicable to the sciences and to universities. On the other hand, I think it's worthwhile to develop definitions of expertise that are not limited to universities, but that still say something meaningful about what expertise is and is not. So now we'll move on to part 4 of this webinar, the interactive part. We will break you into small groups, either based on your answers to the polls or randomly, depending on what makes more sense. You'll have about 15 minutes. Please spend the first 2 to 3 minutes not talking and free writing about a time when you held X kind of expertise in a space where everyone else held Y kind of expertise. And as you free write, please try to hit these points. Describe one misunderstanding from that space. You don't need to be super specific. I recommend keeping the description of this misunderstanding as simple and anonymous as you can. Just really get to the crux of what that misunderstanding was, and describe what you think the underlying root cause of that misunderstanding was, and then describe how you think your particular case maps onto the periodic table of expertise, and or describe how you'd amend the periodic table of expertise to better suit your case. Try to write as much about this as possible, even in shorthand notes in the first few minutes. I just want you to be able to get some thoughts out that feel authentic to you before you start feeling that specific kind of pressure that sometimes arises in groups to say something that resonates with everyone. Maybe you don't feel this, but I definitely feel this. And the cats here are to recognize the absurdity of this exercise. I talked about absurdity earlier, and so much of this to me feels totally absurd, but also worthy of our consideration. Just know that it's okay to sit with the absurdity, and I do it all the time. So we'll break you into groups, put 3 minutes on the clock for your free writing, announce when those are over, and then it's time to start sharing and maybe asking each other some questions that come up for you for the remaining 12 minutes. Everybody ready?